So welcome back. This is going to be our very first screencast for Chapter 24. And in Chapter 24, we are finally starting our discussion on the animals that have a backbone. So these animals are considered vertebrates, and they include the fish, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and at the very end of this particular quarter, we're going to be looking at the mammals. Now, if you are talking about a fish, you are talking about an animal that, as we had said, is considered a vertebrate, which means that it does have a backbone. They do have gills, and they do have limbs, but these limbs are going to be present in the form of fins. Now, usually you're going to have these animals that have a skin that's going to be covered in scales of a dermal origin. Now, there's about 24,600 living species in this group. They have definitely adapted to living in a medium that is about 800 times denser than air, and of course that medium is going to be water. Now, their gills have become extremely efficient at extracting oxygen from the water because that water actually has only 1/20th the oxygen of the air. Now, they do have a special system called a lateral line system that will detect water currents and vibrations. So it's kind of like a fish's sense of touch in this group of animals. Now, when you talk about fish, you're going to talk about actually two very broad categories of fish. We have the first category that's called the jawless fishes, and then the second, of course, is going to be the jawed fishes. And we're going to break that category down even further. When you talk about a jawless fish, you're talking about either a hagfish or a lamprey. Now, both of these members of this group are going to lack jaws in comparison to the other fish that we're going to look at. They do lack internal ossification, and when we say ossification, we're talking about bone. All right, so you're not going to find bone. Typically, most of these animals have a skeletal system that's going to be made of cartilage. They do tend to lack scales, and they do tend to lack paired fins. Now, it's not saying that they don't have fins, they just don't have paired fins. In other words, maybe one on each side of the animal. Now, both groups do share a pore-like gill opening to bring in water to extract that oxygen. And you can see those pore-like gill openings right here, and it's these white dots right along the side of the animal. And of course, they do have an eel-like body shape. Now, the first class is called Myxini, and these are the hagfishes, and there's not really a lot known about these fishes, especially when it comes down to their reproductive behavior. They are entirely marine, and you can see an example of the hagfish over here on the right. They are scavengers and predators of annelids, and annelids were the leeches and the earthworms, mollusks, like clams, etc., dead or dying fishes, and lots of other animals that are found in their environment. Now, what's kind of unique about these animals in the way that they feed is if they do come across a dead or a dying fish, they have the ability or habit of actually entering the animal. In other words, they make their way to the inside. And they do this by entering through an orifice on that animal. Now, that orifice could be the mouth, or it even could be the anus of the animal. And so they dig inside and they use their keratinized plates, and you can just barely see those plates right through here, to sort of rasp away or tear away at the inside of the animal. So it's kind of like being eaten from the inside out. Now, they are nearly blind, so it would be really difficult to see eyes on these animals, but they do locate their food by an acute sense of smell and touch. Now, to provide leverage, you're going to notice these animals can actually tie themselves in a knot. So they're going to tie the knot in the tail, and they're going to pass that knot forward, and it's going to press against the animal's body. And that gives it another advantage when it comes to sort of rasping away at the animal. Now, they do have special glands along the body that secrete a fluid that, once it makes contact with seawater, becomes extremely slimy. And one reason for this would be a really efficient way to escape predators. Now, their body fluids, of course, being animals that do live in seawater, must maintain an osmotic equilibrium or a water balance with that seawater. So they have some special processes that allow them to do this. Now, the circulatory system is going to include 3 accessory hearts, and there's going to be an additional heart that's going to be found behind the gills of these animals. Now, as I had said before, the reproductive strategies of these animals, the behaviors of these animals as they reproduce, is not very well known. In some species, they have found the females actually outnumber the males by 100 to 1, and they're not quite sure why. The females will produce a small number of large, yolky eggs, and they're typically about 2 to 7 centimeters in diameter. But then after they hatch, very little is known about the way that these animals actually mature, and as I had said before, even how they reproduce, or the behaviors that are involved as they reproduce. Now, the second class that belongs to the group jawless fishes is going to be the class Petromyzontidae, and this is going to include the lampreys. Now, the lampreys are going to look very similar to the hagfishes, but there are some differences that you need to make sure that you note. Now, all lampreys in the northern hemisphere are going to belong to this family. Now, the marine lamprey, the Petromyzon marinus, is going to occur on both Atlantic coastlines, and they do grow to a length of about 1 meter. Now, there's about 20 species of lampreys in North America, and about half of these are considered non-parasitic, brook-dwelling species, and of course the other half are going to be a parasitic species. And we'll look at both groups in more detail as we kind of make our way through the screencast. Now, when discussing the lampreys, we know a little bit more about their reproduction than we do the hagfishes, because these animals do tend to ascend freshwater streams in order to reproduce. In other words, what they do is they go upstream. Now, the marine forms are considered anadromous, which means they're going to leave the sea as adults to actually spawn upstream. Kind of similar to the salmon that we're going to talk about a little bit later on in this chapter. Now, in North America, all are going to spawn in winter or spring. The males are going to build the nest by actually lifting stones with their oral discs, so that's going to be the mouth region of the animals, and using body vibrations to kind of carve out a nest for their young. Now, the female is going to anchor to actually a rock that's found very close to the nest, and the male is going to attach to her head. Now, as she lays those eggs in the nest that the male has prepared, the male is going to fertilize them as soon as they've been released. Now, very soon after reproduction, the adults will die. Now, the eggs are going to hatch in about 2 weeks, and they're going to produce an Ammocetes larvae, and you can see an image of this larvae off to the right-hand side and down to the bottom. Now, this larvae looks very different from the adult animal. Now, they're going to live first on the yolk supply from that egg, and as they drift downstream, they're going to eventually burrow into the sandy areas of that stream. And then they're going to become suspension feeders. And they're going to continue doing that until they eventually metamorphosize or change into the adult. Now, the changes that you do see are going to be pretty significant changes. So what you're going to notice is as they make their change into the adult, they're going to have the eruption of eyes that you would find in the adult form. And you can just barely see the eyes right here in the larvae. In other words, they're not very prominent. They're going to have keratinized teeth that are going to replace the hood of the animal. And so this right here is considered the hood of the animal. These animals are considered suspension feeders as larvae, so obviously they don't feed in a suspension way as adults, and so that replacement is going to come in the form of those keratinized teeth. They're going to have an enlargement of the fins, and so in the larvae you typically only have one single fin that surrounds the body of the animal. But the fins are going to change just a bit. They don't have paired fins still because they still, again, fall into this category of jawless fishes, but you're going to see some changes. They're going to have the maturation of the gonads, in other words, so they can reproduce, and there's going to be a little bit of a modification of the gill opening. So instead of noticing the slits that you would see in the larval form, you're going to end up having those pores that you would notice that are kind of typical to the fish that are found within this group. Now, as we had said before, there's a non-parasitic group of lampreys, but we also have about half that are considered parasitic. Most of the parasitic lampreys are considered marine, and they do actually migrate to the sea in order to mature. Other species will remain in fresh water. They're going to attach to a fish by a sucker-like mouth, and you can see the mouth right down here towards the bottom. And you can also see how they would attach to the fish right over here. They've become a really big problem, especially in the Great Lakes region of the northern part of the United States, because they do tend to basically annihilate a lot of the bony fish species that are found in that environment. Now, they use their sharp teeth to rasp through the flesh as they actually suck the fluids from the fish. And you can see right down here, you can see these keratinized teeth in the mouth of these animals, and kind of similar to the snails that we had talked about in the previous groups we had talked about earlier in the year, they're going to rasp away at the scales and eventually cause a pretty significant wound on that animal. And as that wound bleeds, as that wound, obviously as that fish loses fluids, it's going to feed off of those fluids. Now, to make sure that those fluids continue to flow, they tend to inject an anticoagulant into the wound, which basically prevents the wound from healing. Now, when these animals become engorged, the lamprey is going to drop off, but unfortunately, because of the wound, oftentimes when these animals parasitize other types of fish, the fish does tend to die, so it can be fatal to its host. Now, parasitic freshwater adults are going to live about 1 to 2 years before they actually spawn, and then eventually they're going to die after spawning. There are some anadromous forms, in other words, those forms that actually travel upstream, oftentimes from the sea, that will live 2 to 3 years. Now, in comparison, there are some species of non-parasitic lampreys that are actually very similar to what you would see here, in that they're not going to feed once they become mature because their primary goal is to reproduce. And so the digestive tract is going to degenerate, which basically means to break down as an adult, and their main function is to spawn, and unfortunately, they will eventually die. Alright, so that's going to finish up our first screencast for Chapter 24. As always, please make sure that you have completed your screencast study guide before you come to class.